Martha Alderton wheeled one more sack of grain down her cellar steps while the whole market watched. The children pointed. She did not flinch. Her neighbours turned their carts around in the square so she would be sure to see them laughing. And still she went down and came back up and went down again. Josiah Thorne, the richest farmer in the parish, called out across 40 market day faces. "She'll be gnawing her own gold come spring," he said. "The price will never be so kind again, and the mad old crow buys instead of sells." They laughed, but Martha said one thing, quietly, that not a soul in that square would remember until the frost came. 3 words about the swallows flying low. And then she closed her cellar door. If you believe old hands know things young eyes can't see, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. It was autumn in the year 1866 in a fen village called Harrow Fen, out in the flat black country of Lincolnshire. And it had been a good year, a fat year, the kind of harvest that makes a farmer forget every lean one that came before it. The wheat had stood gold and heavy in the fields, the barns were full, the ricks in the yards were built high and proud, thatched neat against the weather, and every man in the parish walked a little taller for the sight of them. Grain was so plentiful that season that the corn factor came down from the town and offered a firm price, 54 shillings the quarter. He wrote it in his book and shook hands on it, and the men of Harrow Fen sold gladly. Why would they not? A high price for grain there was more of than they knew what to do with. They sold, and they pocketed the coin, and they went home and feasted on the glut. There was bread on every board that autumn, there was meat roasting fresh, the alehouse was loud until late, and no man in the parish believed that winter could touch him. Now Martha Alderton was 52 years old, and she kept a small holding at the edge of the village. It had been her husband's and his father's before him. A cottage of grey fenstone, a yard, a barn that leaned a little to the east, and under the cottage, cut down into the dark earth, a deep dry cellar with stone shelves and a good oak door. It was not much, but it was hers, and she kept it well, and there had been a time when the people of Harrow Fen respected her for it. That time had passed. Somewhere over the years her care had turned, in their eyes, into something to laugh at. Her thrift had curdled into a village joke. She mended what others threw away. She kept what others spent. She never took the easy price or the easy pleasure, and a village that was feasting had no patience for a woman who would not feast with them. They called her close. They called her mean behind their hands, and sometimes not behind them. They called her the mad old crow. But I will tell you something they did not see. On the morning I am speaking of, before the market, before the laughing, Martha Alderton had walked the back lane to the Redfern cottage with something wrapped in her apron. Alice Redfern was young and heavy with her first child, and her husband Tom was a labouring man who earned little and owed a little more. Martha knocked, and when Alice came to the door, Martha pressed 6 eggs into her hands, warm from the hen. She did not make a speech of it. She did not wait to be thanked. She said the hens were laying more than one old woman could eat, which was a small lie, and she turned and went back up the lane before Alice could find the words. That was Martha's way. Her kindness went out quietly, by the back door, wrapped in an apron, and she took great care that it should never be seen. I want you to hold that in your mind. Before you hear her mocked, I want you to know the shape of her heart. Because the village did not know it. The village saw only the sacks going down into the cellar, and the coin she would not spend, and the woman who would not laugh when they laughed. There was one thing more about that cellar, a small thing. If you had gone down her steps and looked at the door frame, the oak frame around the cellar door, you would have found a notch cut into it. Deep, cut with a blade, hard, into the wood. It was from the year the water and the want came together, folk said, the ones old enough to remember. But Martha never spoke of it. She never touched it where anyone could see. It was just there, in the dark, a mark in the wood, and she never once explained what it meant. Keep that notch in your mind too. We will come back to it. Now, the market. Every week the square filled, and that autumn it filled with plenty. And it was on one of those bright market mornings that the first of it began. The corn factor's price still stood, 54 shillings the quarter. And a man came round to Martha in the square, one of the factor's own, and he offered her the price for what grain she had. It was a fair price, it was a good price. Any sensible woman would take it, he said, smiling, with the coin as good as in her hand. Martha shook her head. The man blinked at her. He thought perhaps she had not understood. He said the number again, slower, 54 shillings, firm, the best she'd see. And Martha said no. She said she would not be selling. And then she did a thing that stopped the men in the square where they stood. She went to a farmer who had grain left over, more than he cared to store, and she bought a sack of it. Paid him coin, carried it to her cart, and then she went to another and bought again. She was buying. In a year of plenty, with the price high and every wise head selling, Martha Alderton was buying grain and carrying it home. The square went quiet for a moment, and then it laughed. Josiah Thorne stood in the middle of it. He was a big man, well-fed, well-dressed, the churchwarden of the parish and the shrewdest tenant farmer in it, and he loved to be seen as the clever man of the new age. He put his thumbs in his waistcoat, and he looked at Martha loading her cart, and he pitched his voice so the whole market could hear him. "There she goes," he said, "buying at the top of the market like a child at a fair. She'll be gnawing her own gold come spring. That one. Mark me, the price will never be so kind again in our lifetimes, and here's the mad old crow buying instead of selling. Buying grain there's a mountain of. Well, every parish must have its fool, and we've got ours cheap this year." They laughed. The wives laughed. The children laughed because their fathers did. And Martha Alderton finished loading her cart, and took up the handle, and wheeled it home through the middle of all of it, and she did not answer one word. Now you might think that a woman with nothing to say for herself had nothing in her head. That is what they thought. But I will tell you what was in Martha's head, because she told no one, and someone ought to. She was thinking of a barometer, a weather glass that had hung on her wall since her husband's day, and she was thinking of how the needle had been sinking, slow and steady, for a fortnight in a season it had no business sinking. She could not have said why that frightened her in a way she could make a prosperous man understand. That was her trouble, you see. She could feel the winter coming in her old bones and her old instruments. But she could not make the fear sound reasonable to men who were fat and warm and laughing. So she bore the laughing instead. It was easier than the arguing. It was always easier. The next of it came a fortnight on, and this time it was the meat. With the harvest so rich, the men had killed generous. There was fresh meat in the village, more than folk could eat before it turned, and so they ate it. They roasted it. The smell of it drifted down every lane of Harrow Fen, good fat meat spitting on the fire, and the wives stood at their doors well pleased with the world. Martha did not roast hers. Martha salted it. She had her own pig killed, and where another woman would have made a feast of it, Martha made it last. She cut it, and she salted it down in the crock. She built a small fire of green wood, and hung strips of it to smoke, slow, in the little lean-to by her barn. She rendered the fat and put it by in jars, sealed. She let nothing go fresh that could be kept. And this too the village saw, and this too the village laughed at. The market wives were the worst of it. They gathered by the pump and watched the smoke rising from Martha's yard, and they made their remarks loud enough to carry. "Look at her," they said, "smoking and salting like it's a siege, like the French are coming over the fen. Poor old thing, she can't enjoy a good year even when God hands it to her. She'd salt the sunshine if she could get it in a crock." And they laughed by the pump, with their aprons full, and Martha, hanging her strips of meat in the smoke, answered them nothing at all. She only worked, strip after strip, salting the year down against a hunger she could not prove was coming. Now I want you to understand. Everything they laughed at was a thing that would keep. That is the part they could not see. The fresh meat on their tables would be gone in a week and remembered in a month as a fine time. Martha's salted meat would hang in her lean-to and lie in her crocks, and it would still be food when the fine time was a long way behind them. But you cannot argue a full man into fearing hunger. You could only salt your meat and let them laugh and wait. But it was the third time, the third mockery, that was the loudest of them all. And it came on the finest day of that whole bright autumn. There had come a stretch of weather that seemed to prove every laughing man in the parish right. Warm, golden, still, a late warmth that made the fen glow. And on such a day the vestry met, the little council of the parish, in the room by the church. And afterward they stood out in the churchyard in the sun. Josiah Thorne was there, being churchwarden, and the Reverend Amos Pike was there, a mild and careful man who liked his parish orderly and his people confident, and a few others of the middling sort. And Martha, who had business at the vestry about a matter of the poor rate, was there too, at the edge of them. As she was always at the edge, the talk was all of the good year and the good price, and what a man might do with a little coin put by. And in the middle of it, Martha Alderton spoke. She did not often speak in company. But something in that warm, false, golden air moved her to it, and she said her piece plainly, the way you'd warn a child off thin ice. She said the swallows were flying low, skimming the water close to the ground days on end. She said the weather glass on her wall had been falling for 3 days straight and had not come up. And she said she did not like the feel of the Whitsun that was past, how wet it had been, how the wet had sat in the ground and not drained off the way it should. She put these 3 things together, the swallows, the glass, the wet, the way an old hand does, and she said, quiet but clear, that a hard wet season was coming, and that a wise parish would lay by while it still could. There was a silence, and then the churchyard laughed. Oh, how they laughed! On that golden day, under that warm blue sky, with the fen glowing and the year the fattest any of them could remember, a wet old woman stood telling them of ruin, and it was the funniest thing they had heard all season. Josiah laughed loudest, slapping his thigh, wiping his eye. "Swallows," he said, "swallows and a glass tube. The mad old crow reads the birds now like a Roman priest. Shall we all run and hide then? Shall we bury our corn against the swallows?" And even the Reverend Pike, mild man that he was, could not keep the smile from his face. He did not laugh cruelly. That was not in him. But he said, gently, in the tone a man uses to close a foolish subject kindly, that surely the good Lord who had sent them such a harvest would not be so quick to snatch it back, and that old sayings about birds were well enough for old times, but that a modern parish put its trust in the almanac and the market, and not in superstition. And the vestry nodded, pleased with him, and the matter was closed, and Martha Alderton was left standing in the sun with her 3 warnings, laughed down by the whole of the parish's wisdom on the brightest day of the year. She said nothing more. She gathered herself, and she went home. And that was the loudest of all the mockings and the worst of the misjudgments, because it was the truest warning she ever gave them, and they buried it under laughter in a churchyard in the sun. Now the tone of this story turns here, because I have shown you the laughing, and I have shown you the woman who bore it in silence, and you may be asking, as the village never troubled to ask, why would a woman stand a whole parish's scorn and never once defend herself? Why would she salt and smoke and buy and hoard year on year when the world was fat and easy? Why was there a fear in her that no good harvest could talk her out of? The answer was cut in oak, down in the dark, in a notch on her cellar doorframe. And it is time you knew it. There had been another good run of years, long ago, when Martha was young and newly a wife. And the village had been just as sure of itself then. And then a season had turned, a wet season, out of nowhere after a fat one, much like the one she was warning them of now. The rains had come and not stopped. The water table under the fen, which sits always close and hungry beneath that flat black land, had risen and come up into the low cellars and the stores. And what the water did not spoil, the rot that followed did. The grain sweated and moulded. The stored roots went to black slime. And where there had been plenty, in the turn of a single wet year, there was want. Martha had watched it come. A young woman then, with a young husband and a small child. She had watched the food go bad in the store faster than they could eat it or save it. She had watched the price of bread climb out of the reach of a labouring house. She had watched neighbours go thin and then gaunt, and she had felt her own body do the same. And in the worst of that cold, hungry spring, the fever that walks with famine had come into her cottage, as it always comes to the weak and the underfed. And it had taken her child. And then, before the ground had thawed enough to dig, it had taken her husband too. She had buried them both in one cold season, in the same corner of the churchyard where the vestry had laughed at her, and she had buried them because there had not been food, and because no one had laid by, and because the whole parish had been just as sure and just as fat and just as laughing the autumn before the water came. She never spoke of it, but she had gone down into her cellar in the worst of that grief, and she had taken a blade, and she had cut a notch into the oak of the doorframe. A mark, a line drawn between before and after, so that she would never, as long as she lived, forget how fast plenty could turn to a grave. And she had made herself a vow in the dark by that notch, and the vow was this, that she would never again stand empty-handed and watch someone starve. Never again. Whatever it cost her, whatever they called her. That is what the village laughed at. That is what Josiah Thorne called madness, and the wives called meanness, and the whole square called folly. It was not madness. It was a widow keeping a promise made over 2 graves. Her hoarding was not greed. It was grief turned into foresight. It was a woman who had learned, in the hardest school there is, exactly what the smiling ones had never had to learn at all. And knowing that now, watch what she did next, and see if it looks like madness to you. The good weather broke, as good weather does, and the work of the season turned to clearing and storing for the winter. And with the harvest so heavy, the farmers had a new trouble. They had more grain than their barns could hold, and the next season's crop to think of, and they wanted the room. So they began to dump the surplus, to sell it off cheaper by the week, just to be rid of it, to clear the ricks and the granaries for what was coming. Grain that had been 54 shillings was going for less, and less, because there was a mountain of it and nowhere to keep it, and a farmer would rather have a shilling and an empty barn than a full barn and no room to work. And Martha Alderton went round with her cart, and she bought it. All of it she could carry and pay for. She went to Josiah's own yard, where they were shoveling good grain out cheap to make space, and she bought there too, and Josiah stood and watched her load it and shook his head like a man watching a dog chase its tail. The whole square called her mad now, not just Josiah, not just the wives, all of them. Buying the leavings, they said, buying what a sensible man is glad to be rid of, filling that cellar of hers to the beams with grain there's no earthly want for. She's lost what little sense she had. And Martha loaded her cart, sack on sack, and paid her honest coin, and wheeled it home, and took it down her steps into the dark, and said not one word to any of them. and down in the cellar, alone, out of their sight, she made ready. I want to show you this part, because the village never saw it, and it is the truest picture of who she was. Down in the cool dark of that cellar, by the light of a single lantern, Martha Alderton prepared for a winter she alone believed in. First she saw to the drain. There was a stone channel that ran along the low side of the cellar floor, cut by her husband's father to carry off any damp that came up from the fen, and over the years it had silted and part blocked. Martha knelt on the cold stone with a trowel and a pail, and she cleared it. Hand's length by hand's length, she scraped out the packed silt and the old leaf fall and the muck of years, until the channel ran clean and true, and she could pour a jug of water at the high end and watch it run away clear at the low. If the water came again, this time it would have somewhere to go. This time it would not sit and rot her stores. She had learnt that too, in the hardest school. She had learned it standing over the black slime that had been a winter's food. Then she counted. She had a way of counting that no ledger could have bettered. She stacked her sacks against the wall by the doorframe, and she measured the stack against that oak frame, against the notch. When the grain stood level with the notch, she would have enough to see one house through the worst of a wet year, the way there had not been enough, once, long ago. She counted the sacks by touch in the half-dark, her lips moving, and she measured the stack against the mark, and she saw that it was rising toward it, week by week, cart by cart, laugh by laugh. And every time she measured, her hand passed near the notch, and she did not need to look at it to know it was there. Then she saw to the rest. The salted meat, hung and dry, the rendered fat in its sealed jars, the tallow for the candles, so there would be light, the roots laid in dry sand where the damp could not reach them, the eggs put down in a crock of water glass to keep. She went over it all, item by item, in the lantern light, the way a captain goes over a ship before a storm he has seen coming on the horizon that his crew swears is clear blue sky. And when she was done, she climbed her steps and closed her cellar door on all of it, and went up into a village that thought her a fool, and let them think it. And then, one afternoon, the small thing happened that told her she had been right. It was warm rain. Out of season, a soft, close, warm rain that came drifting over the fen in the middle of a spell that should have been sharpening toward frost. It was nothing. A shower. The men in the square barely marked it, and those that did were glad of it, saying it would green the winter grass. They stood in their doorways and let it fall, and thought no ill of it at all. But Martha Alderton, crossing the square with a basket on her arm, stopped, and she looked up. She lifted her face to that warm wet sky, and she felt the rain on it, and she did not smile. Everyone else in Harrowfen that afternoon either ignored the rain or welcomed it. Martha alone stood still in it and stopped smiling, because she alone knew what a warm wet rain, in that season, on this land, was the front edge of. She stood a moment in the wet, with her face turned up. Then she pulled her shawl close and went on, faster than before, and there was no laughter in her now, and no fear you could name either. Only a woman who had heard a door open somewhere far off, and knew what was coming through it. Now I have brought you to the turning of this story, and I want you to see what Martha Alderton did at the very turn of it, because it is the measure of her whole soul, and she did it where no living eye could witness. On an ordinary day, with an ordinary errand as her cover, Martha went to the parish poorhouse. It was a mean low building at the edge of the village where the destitute and the old and the broken were kept on the parish's grudging charity, and in the storeroom of it there was a great bin where the flour and the meal for the paupers was meant to be kept. And that bin, in a fat and careless year, stood all but empty, because a village that was feasting spared little thought for its poorest, and the overseers reckoned they could fill it cheap from the glut whenever the need arose. Martha knew what was coming. She knew the need would arise when there was nothing cheap to fill it with, and she knew that when the hunger came, the poorhouse would be the first place it walked in and the last place anyone would remember. So she took from her own store, from the sacks she had bought at the top of the market and been laughed at for, from the grain stacked toward the notch on her own doorframe, and she carried it, quietly, on an afternoon when the overseers were elsewhere, and she filled the poorhouse bin, meal and flour, measure after measure, until the great bin was full and would keep the almshouse fed through a bad stretch. And then she went away. She told no one, she left no name, she asked no thanks, and she took no credit, then or after. She did not do it to be clever, or to prove a point, or to shame the men who had shamed her. There was nothing strategic in it at all. She did it because a hunger was coming that only she believed in, and because she had made a vow over 2 graves that she would never again stand by and watch the helpless starve. So while the whole parish laughed at the mad old crow filling her cellar, the mad old crow was quietly filling the poorhouse too, out of her own hoard. For people who would never know it was her, against a winter not one of them could yet see. She had done all she could do. Her cellar was near full, her drain ran clean, her meat was salted, her poor were provisioned, her promise was kept as far as one woman's hands could keep it. And there was nothing left now but to wait, and to watch the sky, and to see whether the swallows had lied. They had not lied. The warm rain that Martha alone had feared did not pass. It came back. And then it did not leave at all. The soft, close warmth turned grey and settled over the fen like a lid on a pot, and the rain that had been a single out-of-season shower became a week of it, and the week became something the oldest men could not remember the like of. It fell on the flat black land day and night. It fell on the stubble fields and the winter sowing. It fell on the rick yards and the barns and the low grey roofs of Harrow Fen, and it did not stop. And the ground that Martha had known would not drain, did not drain. The water that lives always close beneath the fen began, slow and patient and terrible, to rise. And in the square, for the first time, the laughter had gone quiet. Men stood in their doorways and looked at a sky that would not clear, and looked at fields turning to standing water, and a few of them, only a few, and only in the very back of their minds where they would not yet let it come forward, began to remember an old woman lifting her face to the rain and not smiling, began to remember 3 words, said in a churchyard on a golden day, that they had buried under laughing. The swallows had flown low, and nobody in Harrow Fen was laughing now. The rain kept on. It fell through the last of October and into November, and the fen lay under it like a drowned thing. Martha watched from her door. She did not go out much now. There was no need. Her work was done, and the sky was doing the rest. The first to go were the potatoes. Josiah Thorne had a fine field of them out past the church road, and he had left them in the ground longer than a wiser man might, because the year had been kind, and he trusted it to stay kind. When at last he sent his men to lift them, they came back grey in the face. Martha heard of it from the carrier. The men had put their forks in and turned up rot, not a few soft ones at the edge, the way a bad patch will spoil. All of them. The whole field, black and slimed and stinking, gone to a wet pulp that clung to the tines and would not shake off. They dug a row and stood over it and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Josiah went out himself to look. He knelt in his own mud in his good coat and lifted a potato in his hand, and it broke open like something dead, and the smell of it came up at him, and he dropped it, and wiped his hand on the grass, and could not get it clean. He said one word. It was not a kind one, and I will not say it here. But he did not think of Martha. Not yet. A man does not go from laughing to knowing in a single field. He told himself it was the wet, only the wet, and that the wheat was still stacked dry in the rick, and the wheat would carry them. Every farm along the fen had its ricks standing tall and gold from the fat harvest. Bread they still had, whatever the potatoes did. A man does not starve who has his wheat in. So they told themselves, and the rain fell on the ricks. It fell, and it soaked, and it seeped. A rick well built and well thatched will shed a fair rain. But no rick in the parish was built for this, because no man alive had needed to build for this. The wet got in at the crown and worked down. It got in at the eaves and worked up, and inside the great stacked bellies of the ricks, where the ears lay pressed warm against each other, the damp woke something. The corn began to sweat. And where corn sweats, in the dark, in the close, the mildew comes. They found it when they came to thresh. Josiah's man pulled the first sheaves from the heart of the rick, and they came apart soft in his hands, and there was a smell off them like a cellar left shut too long, and the grain. When he rubbed an ear out into his palm, was not gold, it was dusted grey. It was furred. It had that blue-green bloom on it that means the seed is dead in the husk, and the flour it makes is poison and not bread. He carried a double handful up to the house and laid it on the kitchen table without a word, and Josiah looked at it, and his wife looked at it. And outside the rain came down on the rest of the rick, and on the 4 other ricks behind it, all of them the same, all of them sweating, all of them turning in the dark from harvest into rot. The saving harvest had failed. And now the larders began to empty. It was quiet at the first. Hunger is quiet at the first. A family eats a little less and says nothing. They finish the fresh meat they had roasted so gladly in the plenty, the meat they had laughed at Martha for salting, and there is no more, because they kept none by. They go to the flour barrel and find it lower than they thought, and they measure a little smaller, and they say the market will have grain. The market always has grain. And they go to the market. And the market was bare. This is the thing they had not reckoned. They had sold their plenty. All of it, or near all. When Crandall the factor came in the fat weeks with his firm price of 54 shillings the quarter, the whole village had sold to him gladly, cartload after cartload, and taken his good money and spent a deal of it on the feasting. What they had not sold, the wet had rotted in the rick. So when the wives came to market in November with their baskets, there was nothing on the stalls to fill them, no heaps of grain, no cheap bread. The village had emptied its own stores in the summer and let the weather empty the rest, and there was one cellar in all of Harrow Fen that was full, and only one, and everybody knew whose. They did not go to her yet. Pride is a slow thing to break, but they began, in the empty market, to be quiet in a new way, and to look, some of them, up the fen road toward a low grey cottage where the chimney smoked and the drain ran clean. Then Crandall came back. He came in his good trap with the brass on the harness, the same as before, and he set up in the same corner of the square, and word went round that Crandall the factor had grain to sell. And they came to him, because where else was there to go? And they asked his price. He named it slow, so they would hear every word. Not 54 shillings the quarter, the price he had paid them in the summer. He named a price near 4 times that. For the very grain, some of it, that he had carried out of their own barns 3 months before. He sat up on his trap, with his ledger on his knee, and he looked down at the ring of faces, the same faces that had sold to him, so glad and easy, and he was not cruel about it, which was the worst of all. He was only reasonable. "It is what the market bears," he said. "You had a good price when you sold. Now the country's short, and the price is up. I did not make the weather, friends. I only carry the corn." And he wetted his pencil and waited to write down their orders. Josiah Thorne stood at the front. Josiah, who had the most land and had sold the most, and had laughed the loudest. He was first to the empty granary, and now he was first to Crandall's trap, and he heard the price, and the colour went out of his face. He had money still. He was not a poor man. But he saw, standing there, what the price meant for the labourers behind him. the men with a wage and a houseful, the Toms of the parish with nothing put by. He saw the winter in it. He heard, though he did not want to, an old woman's voice on a golden day saying she'd not be gnawing anything come spring, and knew the words had been his own, thrown at her, and that they were coming home now to roost on him. He did not answer Crandall. He turned and walked out of the square in the rain, and he did not go home. He went, though he would not yet have called it that, up the fen road, only part way, only to where he could see her chimney. And then his pride caught him and turned him back. Not yet. Not yet. And in a small wet cottage at the low end of the village, Alice Redfern's time was near. She was big with the child now, and it sat low, and the women who knew such things said it would not be long. Tom Redfern had a strong back and a willing pair of hands, and he earned what a labouring man earns, which is little, and owed a shade more than that, which is the way of it. In the plenty they had just managed. Now there was no grain to be had but at Crandall's price, and Crandall's price was a month of Tom's wage for a sack, and Tom did not have it. The flour bin in the Redfern house had a cupful in the bottom, greyed at the edges, and no more behind it. Alice did not tell Tom how little there was. Tom did not tell Alice how little he had. Each of them carried it alone, so the other would not have to, which is a kind of love, and a hard one. And Tom was proud. He would not go begging up the fen. He would not stand hat in hand at any door, not while there was a day's work in him and a chance the weather might break. He kept saying the weather might break. It did not break. One night Alice woke in the dark with the first of the pains, only the first. The far-off ones that a woman knows for a warning and not the thing itself. And she lay in the dark and heard the rain, and she put her hand on the low weight of the child, and for the first time she was afraid. Not of the birth. Women bear that. She was afraid of the after. Of a winter with a new mouth and an empty bin. She turned her face into the blanket so Tom would not hear, and she wept, very quiet, so as not to wake him, and he was awake beside her the whole time doing the very same, and neither one knew of the other. That is Harrow Fen in the hungry dark of that November, and that is as low as this story goes. Now hear how it comes up. Martha Alderton had watched it all from her door. She had watched the potatoes go, and the ricks turn, and the market empty, and Crandall come back with his 4 times price. She had felt no gladness in it. Let no one think she stood at her window warming her hands at their trouble. Every black field was a field she had prayed, in her way would come up sound. Being right had never once been the thing she wanted. She had wanted, all along, only to be wrong, and safe, and laughed at, and left in peace, with a full cellar she would never need to open. But the winter had come, the way she had known it would come, the way she had felt it in her old bones, and read it in the low swallows, and seen it in the falling glass. And so there was a thing she had meant to do since the summer, and now it was time to do it. She did not send word. She did not call a meeting. She was not a woman for speeches, and she had had her fill of the vestry. She simply chose her evening, and it was a grey dusk with the rain gone thin for once, and she went out into her yard, and she lifted the hatch of her cellar and set her lantern down at the top of the steps so the light fell down into it. And then she waited, because she had, that afternoon, said 3 words to the carrier, and the carrier was a talking man. And the 3 words were, "Cellars open tonight." They came up the fen road in the last of the light. The market wives first, the ones who had laughed at her salting her meat, and they came with their baskets over their arms, and they came slow, because they did not know how they would be met. They had mocked this woman for years. They had turned their carts around in the square so she would see them laugh. And now here they were at her gate with empty baskets, and the shame of it was a stone in every one of them. Martha met them at the hatch. She did not make them ask. She had never in her life made a hungry soul ask twice, and she would not begin with these. She looked at them, the whole silent crowd of them there in her yard, and then she looked down into the lantern light at the stacked sacks. rank on rank, more grain than any of them had guessed one woman could lay by, and the salted crocks along the wall, and the strings of smoked meat, and the eggs in their water glass, and the fat in its sealed jars. A cellar full. A whole hard winter stood up in a widow's cellar against the day. Nobody spoke. There was only the small creak of the hatch swinging, and the drip of the eaves, and the breathing of 40 people looking down into the one full larder in a parish of empty ones. Then Martha said, "Quiet. Well, bring your baskets then. It'll not fill itself up your arms." And she went down the steps, and she began to hand up the meal. She had thought on it long how she would do this, so that it should be a help and not an alms. She would not give it away to be a saint. Charity taken breaks a proud back as bad as hunger does. She would sell it, but sell it fair, at the summer price, the 54 shillings the quarter that had been an honest price in the plenty, and not a penny of the famine on top. Those who had coin paid her the fair price and kept their heads up. Those who had none she took on trust, marked in a book, to be worked off or paid back when the world came right, and she let them keep their heads up too. Not one soul went from her cellar that night with the shame of a beggar on them. She had lost too much to know anything but the worth of a person's pride. The wives filled their baskets and turned for home, and one of them, at the gate, stopped. It was the sharpest of them, the one whose tongue had cut Martha the worst over the salting. She stood with her full basket, and she could not get her words out, and at last she said only Martha, and could get no further, and Martha said, "Aye, get home, before the wet comes on. That child of yours'll want its supper." And the woman went crying, and it was not from hunger. Josiah Thorne came last. He waited until the others had gone. He stood back in the dark of the road until the yard was empty, and there was only the lantern and the open hatch and the widow. And then he came in at the gate with his hat in both his hands. His good hat, crushed and turning in his big farmer's fingers. The richest man in the parish. The churchwarden, the one who had called across 40 faces that she'd be gnawing her own gold come spring. He got as far as the edge of the lantern light, and he stopped. He tried, God help him, to make his old joke. It was all he had. He opened his mouth, and something of the old line started to come, some crumb of the mad old crow or gnawing your gold, because a proud man reaches for the familiar thing even as it drowns him, and it died in his throat. He could not say it. He stood there with his mouth open on a joke that had turned to ashes, and he shut it again, and he looked at the ground, and he could not look at her. Martha looked at him a while. She had earned this, if she had wanted it. One word from her now, and she could have paid him back every laugh with interest, in front of his own conscience, and he would have stood and taken it, because he had come knowing he must. She did not say it. She had buried a child and a husband in one cold spring, and it had burned every small thing out of her long ago, and pettiness was among the first to go. She came up her steps with a measure of meal already in her hands, as though she had known which face would come last and what it would need, and she held it out to him across the lantern. "For your men," she said. "You've labourers with children. See they're fed before you. That's a churchwarden's office, or it used to be." And that was the whole of her reproof, and it was enough, and they both knew it was enough. Josiah took the meal. His hands were shaking. He got out, in a voice not much above a whisper, "Martha, I know," she said. "Get on home, Josiah. It's late, and it'll rain again by morning." And she turned from him back to the hatch, and that was mercy, because it meant he did not have to find the rest of the words, and there were no words, and they both knew that too. He went, and at the gate he stopped where the woman had stopped, and he looked back once at the lantern in the yard, and then he went down the fen road in the dark, a broken, proud man carrying a measure of meal for his men, and something in him that had been hard for 50 years was not hard any more. Now, the red ferns. Martha had not forgotten them. She had never forgotten them, not since the summer, not since the eggs. She knew Tom's pride, and she knew Alice's time was on her, and she knew that Tom Redfern would starve in a corner before he would come up her road with his hand out. So she did not wait for him to come. Pride, like Tom's, you do not cure by making it kneel. You go round it. The very morning after she opened her cellar, before the light was well up, Martha took a sack of good meal and a crock of salted meat and a wrapped parcel of the smoked strips and a dozen eggs out of the water glass, and she loaded them on her little hand barrow, and she went down the fen to the low end of the village, to the Redferns' door. She did not knock and stand waiting to be thanked. She set it all down on the step, quiet, the way she had set the 6 warm eggs there in the summer, and she meant to go before she was seen. But the door opened. Alice stood in it, grey and heavy and up too early, because the pains would not let her sleep, and she looked at the food on her step, and she looked at Martha, and she understood the whole of it in one breath. The eggs in the summer. And this now, and who it was that had thought of them when they had nothing, and no one else had thought of them at all. She began to say they could not take it. The words came up out of Tom's pride, which was half her pride too, and Martha stopped her before she was 3 words in. "Alice Redfern," she said, "you are about to bring a child into a hard winter. You will not do it on air, and you will not do it on your husband's temper. I laid this by for a day like this one. This is the day. Take it in before it draws the whole village, and tell Tom he can split me a winter's wood come the spring, and we'll call the book square. There, now it's a bargain and not a gift, and his pride can bide easy." And she picked up the handles of her empty barrow and went back up the fen before Alice could weep on her, which Alice did anyway, in the doorway, with her hand on the low weight of her child. And 3 days after that, in a warm kitchen with flour on the board and a good fire going, and salted meat in the crock and the eggs in the bowl, Alice Redfern's child was born. It came in the night, and it cried its first cry into a house that was warm and had food in it, which is more than many a child in Harrow Fen could say that winter, and would have been more than the Redfern child could have said too, but for a widow's barrow left at a door in the dark. Tom stood in the corner of the little room while it happened, useless the way men are, and when he heard the cry, he put his face in his hands, and in the morning, without a word to anyone, he took his axe up the fen road to Martha's woodpile, and he split wood there until his arms gave out. And he came back the next day and did it again, and the next, and he would not stop until the whole winter's wood stood corded and dry against her wall. It was the only way his pride could say thank you. Martha let it. She understood pride. She had her own. That was the winter. Long and wet and hard as any the fen had known. But no one in Harrow Fen died of the hunger that year. Not one. And there was a reason for that beyond the widow's cellar, though the village did not learn it for a while. The parish poorhouse, at the low bad end of the village, was full that winter, full of the old and the broken and the parentless, the ones with nobody, the ones a hard season takes first. By rights they should have gone under before anyone. The poorhouse store was the thinnest store in the parish, and the vestry had laid nothing extra by. Because Josiah and the rest had voted it a good year, and no need. But when the guardians went to the poorhouse grain bin that black December, expecting to find it near empty, they found it full to the lid with good sound grain. And no man among them could say how. It was the doctor who worked it out, in the end. He was up and down the parish all that winter, and he saw the poorhouse kept fed while the farms went short, and he saw that bin stay full past all reason, and he was a man who liked a thing to add up. And one grain was of a kind, he noticed, that grew on only a few holdings in the parish. One of them was Martha Alderton's. He said nothing to her. He only stood in her yard one bitter afternoon, having called to see was she keeping well, and he looked at her a long moment, and he said, "It was you, the poorhouse bin. It was you filled it in the summer out of your own, and told no one?" And Martha looked back at him and said, "I don't know what you're speaking of, Doctor. Will you take a cup before you go on? It's a raw day." And that was as near as she ever came to admitting it, and he knew, and he let her keep her secret, because a woman who gives like that has earned the right to give it quiet. But he did not let it stay quiet forever. He was not a talking man, but there is a time when a thing must be said aloud for the parish's own soul. It was Reverend Amos Pike who said it. The mild man. The one who had stood in the vestry on that bright deceiving day, and, gentle as he was, had let Martha's warning be laughed down, had said that a modern parish must trust the almanac and the market and not the old sayings. He had thought on that a great deal through the wet autumn. He had watched his parish go hungry after he had helped to laugh away the one warning it was given. It weighed on him. A mild man can carry a heavy weight, and carry it long. And so one Sunday, deep in that hard winter, with the whole parish crowded into the cold church for the warmth of each other as much as for the word of God, the farmers and their wives, Josiah Thorne in the churchwarden's pew, the labourers at the back, the market women who had filled their baskets at her hatch, Reverend Pike went up into the pulpit, and he did not preach the sermon he had written. He set it aside, and he told them the plain truth instead. "I stood in our vestry in the autumn," he said, "and I heard a warning, and I helped to laugh it down. I trusted the almanac. I trusted the market. I trusted the confident men. And I overlooked the quiet one. He let that sit. There is a woman in this parish who read the signs that all of us could have read and none of us would. She saw the swallows flying low. She watched her weather glass fall for a fortnight and told us so, and we called it an old wife's fancy. She remembered a wet Whitsun that we chose to forget, and on the strength of what she read, alone, and mocked for it in our own square, she laid by against this winter, not for herself, for us, for all of us. Nobody moved. The whole cold church was still as stone. She filled her cellar while we laughed, said Pike, and then, telling not a living soul, she filled the poorhouse bin as well, out of her own store, with her own hands, so that the poorest among us, the ones with nobody, should not starve. I have it from the doctor, who traced it, and who I trust as I trust the gospel. The old, the orphaned, the helpless of this parish are alive this morning, because one woman we all laughed at fed them in secret, and asked nothing, and let us go on thinking her a fool. He gripped the edge of the pulpit. His voice was not steady now. I trusted the confident, he said, and I overlooked the wise. God forgive me for it. And so before this whole parish, I ask the forgiveness of the wisest hand among us, Martha Alderton, and I ask you to remember, the next time an old voice says a hard thing you would rather not hear, that old hands know things young eyes cannot see. Martha was not in the church to hear it. She had never been one for being looked at, and she had a notion of what the doctor might have set going, and she had stopped home by her own fire. So she did not see the whole parish turn in the pews, nor the market wives with the tears on their faces, nor Josiah Thorne sat in the churchwarden's pew with his head bowed to his chest and his shoulders shaking. She was spared that, and glad of it, for she would only have been made uncomfortable by it, and she had done none of it to be seen. There was one thing more, and it was the sweetest, though Martha took no glory in that either. Crandall the factor was still in the district, selling his famine grain at his famine price, and doing well out of it, and within his rights, for he had broken no law. He had only bought cheap in the plenty, and sold dear in the want, which the world calls business. But Martha had grain to spare past what her own parish needed, and she did a simple thing with it. She had her barn door faced onto the market road, and one market morning she took a lump of chalk and she wrote a price on that door in figures a yard high, and the price was 54 shillings the quarter. The fair price. The summer price. not one penny of the famine on it, and down the road, in his good trap with the brass on the harness, sat Crandall, with his price 4 times hers. It did not take long. Word of a thing like that runs faster than any crier. The market that had been drifting to Crandall's trap turned, all in a morning, and came up the road to the widow's barn door, and Crandall sat there with his ledger on his knee and watched his custom walk away to a fair price he could not match without losing his own coat. He was not undone by anger. No one shouted him down. No one threw anything. He was undone by a chalk mark on a barn door and a woman who would sell fair when she could have sold dear, and there was no answer to it in all his ledgers. He sat till noon with an empty trap and a full one behind him, and then he wetted his pencil for the last time and put his book away and picked up his reins, and he turned his fine trap round and drove out of Harrow Fen, and he did not come back. That was the whole of his punishment, and it was lawful, and it was complete. They tell that Martha was in her yard when he passed, and that Crandall drew up a moment and looked at her over the wall, factor to farmer, and that he said, half sour and half something else, "You'll not get rich, missus, selling at that price." And that Martha looked back at him and said the only hard words she said in the whole of it, quiet and dry and without a grain of gloat in them, "I did not lay by to get rich, Mr. Crandall. And I did not lay by against you. I laid by against the winter." The winter came, and she turned her back on him and went down her cellar steps to fetch a sack for the next in the queue, and left him sitting there. And that was the last the parish ever saw of Crandall and Vane. The winter broke at last, the way even the worst of them will. The rain thinned and stopped. The water that had risen so slow and terrible under the fen went down again, slow and grudging, back to its beds. And in the spring the black land greened. It always does, in the end. The willows came out along the dikes, and the swallows came back, flying high this time, high and easy in a kind sky, and the fen that had been a drowned grey thing lay green and breathing under a soft light, and Harrow Fen had come through. All of it. Every soul. Martha stood in her cellar doorway on one of those first green mornings. The cellar behind her was low now, near emptied into a whole parish that would not have seen the spring without it, and that was the only sight in all the world that could make an empty cellar a glad thing to her. She stood in the doorway, and she put out her hand, the way she did every spring, the way she had done every spring for more years than she let herself count, and she laid 2 fingers on the deep old notch cut in the oak of the frame. She never spoke of that notch. No one in the parish knew what it meant. It was cut from the year the water and the want had come together, the year the flood spoiled the stores and the hunger came, the year she carried her child and then her husband out through that same doorway in one cold spring and buried them both in the churchyard while the whole fen starved around her. That was the vault of her. That was the whole of why. Not madness, not miserliness, a vow, cut into oak with a knife on the worst day of her life, that she would never again stand by empty-handed and watch the want take the people she could have fed. She had kept it. This spring, with a full parish and an empty cellar behind her, she had kept it at last, all the way she had sworn she would. She touched the notch, and she did not weep, for she was long past weeping, but she stood a while with her fingers on the old wound in the wood, and something in her that had been clenched tight for a very long time let go, just a little, into the green morning. There was a sound at her gate. She turned. There was no one there, but on the step, set down quiet and left without a word, the way she herself had left the eggs at the Redferns' door, there stood a full sack of good seed corn, the best seed corn in the parish. And going away down the fen road, not looking back, his broad churchwarden's back stiff, with a pride that had learned at last what it was for, went Josiah Thorne. He had left it, and said nothing. He had not the words, and he knew there were none, and so he had done the only thing a proud man can do when he has been wrong all his life and wants to say so. He had left seed corn on the step of the woman he mocked, that she might sow again. And he had gone before she could thank him, because he could not have borne to be thanked, any more than she could. Martha looked at the sack a long while, and then, for the first time in that whole long story, on that green spring morning, with the swallows high and the fen alive, and the parish whole, and the notch touched, and the debt of a lifetime paid, the old woman smiled. Old hands know things young eyes cannot see. That is all. That is the whole of it. Not magic, and not madness, only a long memory, and a hard-bought care, and the plain stubborn decency to lay by in the good days against the bad ones that always, always come. The village that laughed learned it the hard way, which is the only way most of us ever learn anything worth knowing. And a widow they had called the Mad Old Crow lived out her years respected on her own small holding, her drain running clean, her cellar filling every autumn. Her door open to any soul in want, and the swallows over Harrow Fen, every year after, watched close by more eyes than hers. If you'd have laid by with Martha, if you believe old hands know things young eyes can't see, tell me in the comments the town you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this old story travels.